Real quick before we get into the interview. One of the first exercises I run with executive teams is mapping their business portfolio to visualize the current work in progress and how it aligns to the overall business strategy. Now, without exception, every time I run this exercise, the gap between the current state and desired state is far wider than every executive believed, hoped, or even imagined. I've put the exact template to use, how I do this, and made it free for all of you to download by following the link in the comments. Go get your copy and let me know how it goes. Now back to the show. Welcome to the Unlearn podcast. On this show, I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Lennox. Now, I met Richard many years ago when he was a senior director at Skyscanner, one of the world's leading travel and booking flight aggregators. Now, at the time, Skyscanner was at a real pivotal moment in their journey. They had an engineering team of 30 and an operations team of 60. The business was going through rapid scaling and on the verge of doing something really special, but they were struggling. Richard was the person who started to think about how could they change the way that they operate, build products, release them, and get focused on outcomes to drive great results. It was a pleasure to work with him on that journey, and it's always stood with me as somebody that I love to talk to about building high-performance teams and cultures. After Skyscanner grew and eventually exited, he went on to work in another startup, this time called Current Health, a totally different environment. It was focused primarily initially on a hardware device, but then started to think about home care. On that business, Richard moved into the COO role, where he was leading teams and growing the business, something I've certainly experienced about shifting from a product leadership role to a business leadership role and thinking more about how you grow a company rather than just an individual product. On this show, it's great to hear Richard talk about his experiences, his lessons learned. He's an accomplished technologist and a great leader and mentor for many people going through this journey. So before we get started with let's go back to where it began for him.
Enjoying the podcast? Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. This way, you won't miss any episode and it greatly supports our podcast.
All right, Richard, unbelievable to have you on the show. It's funny, I think back of the first time we met in Edinburgh, probably in the middle of winter. Skyscanner was just at a real pivotal point in its growth journey. You were really starting to scale up the teams, implement things like DevOps, and you taught me a lot about drinking whiskey. So it was a great time in my life. Might have been a stressful time in your life. And obviously you've gone on to build, not only Skyscanner to a fantastic exit, but also done it again in a totally different domain with Current Health. So, what I think a lot of people are going to be interested in is your story as being part of these early stage startups and scaling them to successful exits, which is a fascinating story in itself. But when you look back on your own career, is there sort of a moment in time where maybe it didn't mean a whole lot, but in retrospect, it sort of was a real sort of inflection point for you in your career and how you started to, decide that building early stage companies and scaling them was something that you really wanted to do?
Well, I think I actually got really lucky early on in my career, having chosen to go down the route of joining an early startup. That was my first role back in early 2000s after university. I'd done a bit of traveling. I didn't really feel like going and doing a big 4 graduate program, and I got stuck in at a small startup. I think fundamentally I look back at that and it kind of basically said my role coming off a computer science degree wasn't to write code. It's to deliver valuable software and to deliver value to customers. And while maybe not at the time, I think as I've moved through the career, as I've hit Skyscanner and saw that growth, and then even into how we do Current Health, I think that's the one lesson that has probably shaped everything that I've done around, how to grow a company. And it is really focused on that customer value first.
This is one of the terms where a lot of people probably go customer value, but what is that, right? And in different businesses, it means very different things. I think like when we met, Skyscanner was at a really interesting juncture, right? I think there was like maybe 30 engineers. The operations team, which you were leading, was maybe even double that, because you had a lot of the people who were writing the sort of scrapers of the sites and gathering all the information together. right? And you were trying to champion this movement of DevOps. Jez had just written continuous delivery. I was working for ThoughtWorks. Myself, Ian Cartwright, and a couple of other people landed up in Edinburgh. That your company was just going gangbusters. Skyscanner was really starting to take off, really starting to hit the beginning of the J curve. You were starting to expand the product portfolio. There was a high sort of request to ship not only more features, but like expand the business. Like you had just done your first car rentals. You were starting to look at hotels. It was really starting to like create these portfolios of product expansion, which was just fascinating time to be there. So for many folks who's never experienced that sort of moment of like, they're strapped onto the rocket ship and it is going at a speed that most people never anticipated, and everything's breaking and everybody's like wondering like what the hell's going on and why aren't we shipping software faster? So, what were some of the things you had to unlearn in your own approach to building customer value? Like what were some of the things that sort of stuck out to you? Because I can think of loads of great stories over that time we were together there. So,
I mean, there's almost too many to talk about, Barry. I think there's a lot of shit, make it up as we go along, kind of factors into that. I think one of the main things was when you were growing the portfolio, when you were growing a significant user base, and I think over the course of that, we're probably still in the low millions of active users if we'd even got there at that point. And I think one of the challenges was always the pain it was feeling when it was going wrong. So often whenever, the site was going down or we're having a release, and I actually remember not long before you came in, we were having at the time we measured value per web session. So, how much revenue were we making off the back of every web session? I think about 6 months into my tenure, it was dropped from 13 pence, so 13 cents equivalents, down to 10. And that's a significant drop, a significant signal of how do we get through that? This is off the back of a significant release, 3, 4, 5 months worth of engineering features delivery. 6 months in, I hadn't been part of that delivery, but I had to work out what the hell was going on. And you try and unpick some of those months and months of work to work out what was broken. There has to be a better way to do that. I think there has to be a better way to think about it. And that's where, thinking more around how we delivered more frequently, how we delivered more value, how we did testing, all of these things around product engineering were coming out because of that reason. We weren't delivering what we thought we were. And it wasn't helping people find their flights, find the cars, find the hotels. And yes, we wanted to expand. We wanted to grow. But actually, how we were delivering software in a fairly traditional way at the time simply wasn't working for us and causing more pain. And in the end, we had to do something different. But I don't think that's the only time. I think that was pretty much constant through the 8.5 years that I did at Skyscanner. There were times when we'd grown the team to 50, to grown the team to 150, grown the team to maybe 300 engineers over that period. In various places, there were things that were working and there were things that were blockers, and they always had to go through that cycle of why are we not delivering enough value? Why are we not delivering software over here? The numbers become scary. I think by the time we left, we were processing through our data platform, 500,000, 1 million data points a second, which is a fairly significant scale at any company. But we couldn't have done that without, back in 2010, without iterations after iteration after iteration of working out how to get there and facing the problems straight up. I think there were times when it's people problems. There's times when it's straight technology blockers. In the end, it comes down to what's our system of delivery and how do we align everything and join those dots up. Because it gets really, really challenging. And actually I remember, maybe around 2014, 2015, where our 250 odd engineers, we stopped everything. We'd stopped it when you guys were around in 2010, 2011 to these things. But we get to 3 years later and we literally said, no, we're stopping everything. We're going to revisit where our constraints are and we're going to restart one thing at a time in order to rebuild this engine. And that was when, we kind of went through an organizational structure around squads, and then we ended up rolling that out into growth and marketing, which is super fascinating, as well as to how you drive towards outcomes with smaller teams rather than focus on just what you're delivering.
Well, like one of the things that struck me instantly when I walked into Skyscanner was, you did really focus on outcome, right? There was boards on the wall with real-time metrics, as you said, like the average revenue per session. Like there were metrics everywhere up on the wall, and that was one thing that really struck me, is that there was this ticker as well, of how much revenue you'd made every day, and people would get this great sense of contribution. It always struck me that they're in there, they're working hard, they're trying to do the things, but they could see this sort of, the revenue number tick up or the sessions go up or down. And that was one thing that really struck me that was very unique. The other thing that sort of really struck me is how you used to manage the teams. So every morning, we'd come in and you'd have this whole sort of operations group, all together, 60 odd people for sort of, 10, 15 minutes, where they would sort of go through like what happened overnight, any issues, like talk to me. And then people would just get on and execute for the rest of the day. So tell me a little bit about, you sort of got to evolve from these sort of teams then when I was there with you in sort of whatever it was, 2010. But then a couple of years later, you evolved to the squad. And this is something that so many startups really struggle with, is going from these like very execution focused teams to then actually having to sort of atomize, if you will, to these smaller squads to actually go faster. So tell us a little bit about some of the things you had to unlearn as a leader to go through that, because this was around a time, I think, where everybody was trying to copy the Spotify model, whatever that was. But cross-functional dedicated teams were something that was always interesting at Skyscanner and how to evolve into it. So let's talk a little bit about how you got there with that.
So I think firstly, I would say it's built on that foundation of understanding the data. When you go back to 60-person operating things, we had those dashboards. We knew what sessions looked like. We knew what good looked like. We knew what traffic patterns looked like from day to day. So we could benchmark that. And I think that sets us up. The more you instrument, the more you can move forward at scale. And then it's around how, when you get bigger and into larger bigger kind of engineering units or product teams, how you break that down into systems where people can focus. And so it's then how do you break down those numbers into areas of focus. So when we moved to cross-functional teams or squads, and we took huge inspiration from what was said about Spotify and delivered that. I would say we delivered it in our way. And that was because we worked out, how do you break down these numbers and say, you're accountable, not just for this product set, but these are the numbers by how which we measure the success against those. And so you can align people around those metrics. And then us as leaders had to learn not to be over every single one of those metrics. For 4 or 5 years, I could probably talk as well as anyone about any metric across the business. But as the team grows and evolves, you've got to say, what are the key ones that we're going to care about? And how do we push more of the leading indicators? I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned is, how do you accelerate decision-making? Because it is that acceleration of decision-making which forces you to push those decisions closer into the teams and give them the freedom to act, to make decisions. I think that has to be coupled with the speed in which you undecide or you reverse that decision. Because the sooner you can work out you made the wrong decision, and everyone will make a wrong decision based on context at a time and learn something new. The sooner you can learn how to reverse a decision and take a different path. I think the tricks for scaling is rapid decision-making and how you invert the decision when you make it wrong. The more you hang on to a wrong decision, the worse the impact is.
I love this because it sort of harks back to, Jeff Bezos's two-way doors type scenario, right? Is how do you get to these places where teams can make decisions and see if they're moving in the right direction, and so they've higher conviction to double down, or they're going in the wrong direction and they struggle. But again, the trick that you've sort of shared as well is instrumentation is key for these teams. Like they need to know the outcomes they're achieving. And again, that was something that just struck me instantly when you walked into Skyscanner. There were metrics everywhere. Teams talked about how things were moving, how they were contributing to it. And then when you go to this model of having cross-functional teams with outcomes that they own, they understand if they are the search team, like how quickly is the results coming back? What breadth of information are we getting? Are we covering all the airlines? Like these are sort of some of the great questions I would always hear the teams talk about there, is because they understood their context, the mission, what customer value actually was for them. And it wasn't just sort of pull out the dashboard once a quarter. It felt like every day people were talking about these things and driving them. So how did you start to instill that culture? Because many companies, whether it's OKRs or outcome setting or, these are all sort of flavor du jour techniques that companies constantly talk about, but they often struggle to get started with them. So what were some of the things that you did to start instituting that culture of defining outcomes, giving accountability to teams, making these decisions and, leveraging sort of two-way doors, if you will, about what's working and what's not?
Well, I think firstly, I would make a distinction between the underlying instrumentation and measurement of results doesn't necessarily equal goals and targets and what you're trying to achieve. So firstly, you have to learn what's important to the business. So what is important to customers? I think at Skyscanner, we were very lucky. Everyone used Skyscanner. We were our own customers. We were dog food. So if a search was rubbish, there was people searching within the business every single day on the flights that they wanted. So we're seeing this real customer. We were our own customers, which adds value. But then all that instrumentation would allow us to add value over the top. And then you layer on, what do we want to achieve? And I think what I find really interesting about, say, OKRs right now is often the key results are, I have done X or have we done Y? And I find
objective
that really
is change the world. Key result is, have I done my project? Tick.
Yes. And actually, one of the things that the instrumentation does, because you understand the dynamics of your customer behavior through your instrumentation, you're able to say, well, what are the customer behavior changes that we want to see? And we can align those to the actual instrumented metrics. We want to see, I don't know, pick a simple measure, searches per booking, which is pretty typical. You want to say how many searches does it take to find a booking? Well, we know that, and we know we've instrumented that for every booking, an individual will search 10 times. Okay, is it meaningful to change that number? And what would it mean to change that number? Are we helping people find the flights that they want faster, or are we in a different phase of the booking cycle, which is more research versus not? And so we have to use those to design those hypotheses and product work and say, right, these are our things, and how can we test what we measure? And I think at scale, when you get lots more hypotheses and products will evolve at a different rate. But because of the underlying instrumentation, you set the culture of we're going to be metrics driven anyway. And so as you're building a startup, how are we going to measure what value we're delivering has to be a question up front. And I think when I see startups today, I think one of the things I characterize, everyone is trying to get to first customer, and they see first customer success as the product. Okay, if we change that narrative and say, what is the value that we're delivering on the 10,000th customer using that product, you start to see a different behavior, because you start to see, well, how will I know 10,000? So rather than say, what is my get to market, get this feature out the door plan, it's what do I get to get this feature to the 10,000th usage? You will see a different behavior within the underlying team because it changes the conversation.
Well, what was the most fun experiment you ran that had the unintended consequences? Is there anyone that comes to your mind where you're like, you had a hypothesis, you thought it would come together and something totally different came out?
I would say that's a difficult question. There's so many. I think there's one or two that sticks in my mind around, how we attached things like car hire to flight search. So you find your flights, do you want has car hire? And I think one of the unintended consequences of that is you start to see a drop off in flight search. And I think it's that concept of, did we just provide too much information on too many topics to the user at the same time? And I think that is one of the interesting dynamics, which is you have one of these products, certainly in Skyscanner and travel search, where for most people, booking travel is probably quite overwhelming, particularly when you do it. And so you're not going to book it in one go. You're going to maybe book your flights, then you'll come and book your hotels, and then you'll come back and work out the smaller details like car hire, like other things. And so when you think about it from a customer behavior perspective, it makes total sense that trying to do everything in one session is going to hurt and overwhelm people and have a negative impact. And at a more macro scale, as a travel search product, I think that's experiments that go wrong when they overwhelm the user.
Yeah, it's a great one. Yeah, and it's a great example of sometimes optimizing a little bit for what you think people might want or what's healthy for the business is let's bundle it and give them a deal. But it can cause cognitive overload. It's interesting. And the paradox of choice is always my favorite one. Give people one option and they'll take it. Give them 3, they'll struggle. 5, they can't get anywhere near it.
And I think that's really interesting how you think about that in teams and how you lead teams. I think too many times people go to their leader and ask for an opinion on choice A or choice B versus a recommendation. And actually trying to get your teams to say, don't ask for an opinion, lead with your opinion, is more empowering than, them coming to you as a leader with options.
Yeah, no, I love that. One of my favorite stories that I put in the Unlearn book was there's an executive at a very large bank in the US, and her team used to come into her all the time with just making decisions. They were everything from ordering the pencils to should they open a new office in a different city. And she always felt like there was a decision-making problem, and one of the things when we were trying to help the teams unlearn there was it was a very simple prompt. Every time somebody asked her to make a decision, her reflex had to be, I don't know, what do you think? And then if somebody would sort of freeze and go, well, hang on, you're the boss, you need to tell me what to do, she would know that they would need help. Where the folks who would go well, actually, here's the options. We've got A, here's the pros and cons, B's pros and cons, C, pros and cons. I think we should do C because here's why. Those were the people that she could instantly go, right, I need to give that person more agency to make decisions because they're not afraid to do it and they got rationale, and that is always a sort of challenge, I think, when you're building these businesses about how do you get folks to start making, more decisions or have more confidence doing it.
Yeah, for sure. You gotta almost give them permission up front and set that expectation that it's their job to make decisions, and help them get there.
Yeah. So let's jump forward now to your sort of next iteration, right? So Skyscanner was a absolute, resounding success, fantastic business, grew, scaled it, sold it. It's always fun, but doing it once wasn't enough for you, right? You had to go back and do it all again. So you shifted industry out of sort of travel into health, which is a very complex area. And then you probably shifted technology really from customer facing to building deep, data-driven understandings and products with Current Health. So first of all, tell us a little bit about who Current Health are. And then why did you go there when that opportunity arose?
So Current Health provide a platform to enable care to be delivered at home. So when you think about most of us have a grandparent, a parent who has had an unnecessary stay in hospital where they could well be treated at home, but the technology didn't exist. So starting with a physical medical device, which is a totally different again, so an actual hardware product that does remote patient monitoring, instrumenting the home to provide that data back so that we can enable clinical decisions. And we know that the clinical outcomes are generally better we know there's pressure to keep people out of hospital, and we saw that through the pandemic, particularly as those types of care models grow, and we see that through into a number of different kind of facets. How do you take that data and help support clinical decisions? And obviously, it's a highly regulated, it's a Class 2A medical device. It's a whole shift from what we were doing at Skyscanner. I joined because it had purpose. I joined for the challenge of a new role, and I joined because of the team. The two founders, Chris and Stu, exceptional individuals in their own rights, and I felt I could add value and help them go on that journey. We eventually sold to Best Buy in November 2021, which is probably a story in its own right. Why Best Buy and why Best Buy Health? Your big blue and yellow electronics retailers, what's happening there? But it was the right thing at the time. It was to be accelerative to what we felt was our mission. I think what I find really interesting about that journey, though, is it moved very quickly from being a simple hardware data plane to actually how do you really operationalize care at home programs? And that goes beyond, the product and the technology. It's why Current Health employed a team of nurses to support delivering that care remotely, and to help our own kind of health system partners to deliver the model of care needed. So totally different journey, successful in its own way, and yet challenging in pretty much every way possible.
Yeah, well, it is I always think it's fascinating when you're doing hardware and then eventually it becomes part of a wider sort of system, right? Like you to this point on metrics, you sort of become the telemetry device, right? Like you're the sensor, the hardware, whether you're, people who wear Whoops and want to measure or Oura rings and understand their biometrics. But that's only one part of the puzzle, right? The software that goes around these things, whether it's teaching you to sleep better, exercise more, like care for people within the home, right? The device is almost like the beachhead to sort of access this whole ecosystem and then start to build around it. So tell us about what were some of the interesting things about defining customer value? Because the device is one thing to sort of, get the insight, get the metrics, get the telemetry. But as you sort of alluded to, the actual customer experience is everything that goes around that. So having care, having nurses available. So talk to us a little bit about how you started to define customer value in Current Health, and how does it evolve as the startup sort of started to scale and get more traction and grow?
Well, I think you're right on several points. The hardware becomes a commodity in that scenario. It is there to capture the data and get the data out. And getting the data out of patients' home is as difficult a problem, particularly as you're talking most of these patients quite challenging environments, don't necessarily have internet or Wi-Fi connection even today. And so actually the hardware is a difficult challenge, but it's itself a commodity to those data. I think the real underlying metric for Current Health was how many patients do we have under care at any one point in time, and how are we growing that? Because every customer, whether it be a health system, so when I talk about customers, I'm talking about the health system, the clinical practitioners, they're treating patients. And so how do we think about that? So how many patients are they successfully treating and concurrently is the most important number there. And then you lead that out. So what are the constraints to how they deliver that care? And I think one interesting thing is the way, if you're admitted into a hospital ward today, like you get one admission, fine well that your meals are going to come 3 times a day, because that happens every day. A nurse is going to be on the ward every day. Your physiotherapist is going to turn up at 10 a.m. Like, these are just things that just happen when you're admitted into a ward in a hospital. All the entirety of the systems have been built around that. You try and take that model and apply the same treatment in someone's own home, then you've got a whole different set of constraints. How do you orchestrate those services? And so to actually get to the point of a patient under care in their own home, there's a huge number of cogs that have to turn to get there. And not least that you have to be able to monitor the health of these patients remotely, And that's where you end up having to say, like, we will support you to do that. And here is our team of highly skilled nurses that are able to remotely monitor patients across multiple customers and identify those at risk and contact the relative clinicians when that risk happens. So from a technology startup, we're into a whole, how do we operationalize care? It's a whole different model. And that's why we think about the tie-up with Best Buy, who are doing exactly the same mission, but have the capabilities and the strengths in kind of supply chain, logistics, broader technological support that allow us to tie these things together into that care at home orchestration.
One of the things that was great for me to see as you went through that journey, in Skyscanner, you had very much a technology leadership role, right? Where you sort of went to this role of COO essentially for current health, which again is what's interesting is like watching your evolution as a leader from, going from helping the technology and building these great, robust, scalable, high frequency and performance software systems to now like starting to build a business and sort of help create that sort of structure and success around it. So for someone like me too as well, who I also always struggle, I'm not necessarily going to be a CTO or a chief product officer because there's people who are better at that than me in these various different domains. And yet like getting things off the ground, started moving, like that's my jam. Give me problems we don't know how to solve, I'll figure them out. Like that's always been where I've ended myself up in these businesses. So tell us about your own sort of journey that you had to unlearn as you went from this different sort of focus to, being the operations officer for this business as it started to scale.
So I think operations officers, everyone is different. And it's kind of one of those titles. And I think I was the partner to Chris as a CEO, and we used to have that relationship. And that was the most important thing. Our job was to run the business. I think for me, switching from that functional leadership into an outward-looking business leadership perspective is a much more interesting and journey, but also where you have to change your habits. I think working on the product engineering side of things and leading as a functional leader, you tend to be saying, how do I help my function be more successful? As soon as you take that chief title, whatever the X is, the CXO title, your role is changing. It has to be this outward looking, how are we running the business? Doesn't matter what your discipline is, but I think you're changing your mindset from saying, I'm going to represent my function to I'm representing the business with my function behind me. I think that shift is probably the biggest leadership hurdle I've gone through. Now, I would say my background in engineering and systems thinking is really aiding that journey because I can see how different parts of the operating system of business is connected. So there's a real link there that I think is highly valuable. But equally, you have to think your mindset has to shift as soon as you take that exec level role, that chief title, has to shift into how do we run this business and make this business successful over how do I make my function deliver successfully.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear that from someone like yourself who's sort of done that transition, right? Like I often joke, it feels like, you're there to support in any way that needs to be done, right? At Currency in Nobody Studios, I'm the Chief Incubation Officer, which basically means I do everything. If the bins need to be taken out, I'm on it. If we need to do a presentation to the CEO of a Fortune 500, I'm on the call. It's a little bit of everything, and I guess that's something I certainly enjoy. But I love the way that you describe it, that you've got to think more about growing the business. And that was one of the huge ahas for me with Nobody is, I used to always think that I loved building the products, like figuring out the features, the customer problems, and that getting that chemistry right to find a product market fit. But what I actually have enjoyed way more in the studio is actually building the business and thinking of the business sort of like a product and how do we improve the capabilities, the features, the functions of the business so it becomes a performant entity. And, that's something that certainly has surprised me over the last couple of years. And it sounds like you had a bit of a similar experience with that as well.
Totally, and it's totally like I made the conscious choice to make that shift. Like it was a desire of mine to go and do a slightly different role in just the product, and I think pushing yourself out there to do that is really important. But the flip side is going through that journey and saying, I'm actually building a business, but the business is there to deliver value, and in the outcomes, and that goes back to that customer value. Is I'm building the business to deliver the most customer value possible out of the resources that we have under our control. For me, I found that CEO probably doesn't have that resource constraints in their mind. They have all ideas and the strategic direction, but they do so without having a view of the underlying resource constraints or market constraints to that. I think as CEO, I had to bring that mindset, and I think my is, hey, it's never a no, but it's a not now, or it's a if we do this, what are we not going to do instead? Because there is constraints. We all have some limit. Ideas are limitless. Giving enough time, money, and resources will deliver anything. But chances are time, money, and people are going to be constrained on achieving anything. And so, not now, or maybe later, is probably the best answer you can ever give. But you never say no.
Yeah, no, I like that. Yeah, and or even, the way I like to frame it, where if we do this, what are we not going to do? And I think that's always a great forcing function. So looking forward for you, right? You've been involved over the last number of years in two fantastic businesses. And, I know you have a huge passion for mentorship, coaching, helping companies go through the process and give back, if you will, to the community and the industry overall. So what are some of the things you're most excited about and looking forward to over the next couple of, months?
I think there's two sides to that. I think I want to see more people have the opportunities that I've had, go through the success, the highs, the lows, the super fast roller coaster. And it is difficult. And I think most people realize it probably comes with a degree of sacrifice on other factors. But I think people should be able to forge successful careers. So that's a big part of it. And through that, I think driving, businesses through the startup into scale phase, where you get a much vaster range of skills, learning opportunities than you do in a typical sustained organization where you're just part of a bigger function in a bigger team in a bigger company. So I believe in those experiences. I've been lucky enough to be two success stories in the tech sector out of maybe 10 or 12 in Scotland at a maximum. I want to see Scotland do more. And, if I can combine those two over the next few years, that would be awesome.
Yeah, well, look, I'm always following what you're doing, Richard, and enjoying it. And also probably some of the best whiskey recommendations anyone's going to get, especially if they visit you in Scotland as well. So listen, thanks for being on the show, sharing all your stories, your experiences, and inspiring many people, I'm sure, to get out there and start building stuff. So we'll definitely have you back again. And thanks very much for sharing.
Thanks very much for having me, Barry, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode useful, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please consider leaving a rating or a review, as it helps others find our podcast. For more episodes and details about the show, visit barryoreilly.com, and we'll see you on the next episode.